Welcome to this second of our talks on the Sermon on the Mount. Today we're looking at a short passage, Matthew 5, verses 13 to 20, but it's very deep. It contains, I believe, three of the most wonderful and terrifying sayings of Jesus. This, as I said in the first talk and will repeat again and again, is Jesus teaching to those who are already following him. This is, if you like, a manual of discipleship. It is for those who already belong to Jesus, and it's about how we belong to him better, how we follow him, how we really become his disciples, how we live for him. And it's wonderfully encouraging, and it's terrifyingly challenging. Now, what I'm saying in this talk is in some ways completed or held together with the following talk. So please keep both of those together in your mind when we get to the following one, because it's impossible in just half an hour to do justice to these few verses. But the rest of chapter 5 is simply explaining and opening up what these three verses, these few verses, are saying. So hold it all together. And it all bears in mind what we had last time in the Beatitudes, that we are already blessed. Blessing isn't just for the future. Blessed is now. Blessed are you. And particularly, if you like, blessed are you, poor in spirit, those who know your weakness and your unsuitability to be a child of God, those who know our sinfulness and all the rest. We are already blessed. We are blessed. We are his children. We are held in his everlasting arms. We are held in his love. That's the background to this. Grace comes first. If you want to put it in Paul's language, we are saved by grace through faith. Don't let anything take that away as we come to the deep, deep challenges of learning to be a disciple. Now, last time we saw that the deep challenges of being a disciple might include persecution. They will certainly include the struggle towards purity of heart and so on, which is more of what we have in this session and the next one. But grace comes first, and we can rely on God's grace. But then we come today in verses 13 to 20 of Matthew 5 to these three astonishing sayings. Two of them similar on the face of it, but with their own nuances, and then the third a bit different. You are the salt of the earth. Again, as with the blessings, not you will be, but you are. If you're a Christian, if you're a follower of Jesus, that's what you are. You are the salt of the earth. And then second, you are the light of the world. And both of these are about our Christian self-confidence. Not always saying, I need to learn more, I need to know more, I need to be protected and built up within the community. Salt and light are both called to get out there and do their job. Light isn't to be hid under a basket of any sort or a cover. Light is to be out there in the darkness. That's light's job, to shine in the darkness. And salt, its job is to be distinctive in a bland world. You can take salt in so many different ways. It's distinctive, it's different, as light is different from darkness. Jesus is assuming that the world is bland, it needs salt. He's certainly assuming the world is dark and it needs light. Difference. We are to be different. We are different if we're followers of Jesus. And that difference must be worked out, which is what this session and the next one are all about. Salt isn't just different or distinctive. It really makes a difference, doesn't it? A few grains of salt transform the taste of a meal in one sense. A small amount of salt preserves and saves meat or other things from going off, and it preserves well just a small amount. And a small amount of salt, if there's any sort of wound or damage, stings. Or as one great preacher on this passage says, salt bites. And we receive the salt of Christ as he bites, stings at our sinfulness, as we're reminded again and again of our sinfulness and unworthiness. The salt is having its effect on us, and we in some way need to bring that into the world. It's the Christian calling to be different. It's the Christian calling in some way, even in tiny quantities. Just a grain or two of salt will do it. Just one or two believers in a workplace or a school or a community, one or two believers can make a difference by being different, not by being the same, but by being there and different. Being, as Jesus puts it later on, in the world, but not of it. That's the Christian calling, not to be shut away from the world, but to be in the world, but not of it. Different, but present. That's what salt is. And that will actually sometimes cause pain and discomfort. If our preaching and teaching and if our being Christians never causes pain and discomfort, there's something wrong with it. It's lost its salt. But it also is a preserving thing. Just a small amount of goodness in the midst of badness, a small amount of light in the midst of darkness preserves and protects very deeply and powerfully. And these are difficult things. A Christian who is the one who doesn't laugh at the dirty joke or the joke that's undermining someone. The Christian who is the one who doesn't condemn the world, but just doesn't join in with everything, makes a difference and is noticed and is there as a sign of something better in the world. That's the sort of thing we're called to be. A Christian whose light is truthful. A Christian who is willing to forgive terrible things. You've all heard examples. I've heard plenty of examples and seen them of Christians who have forgiven those who have committed terrible acts that have killed their children. Christians who have been in a place where they could be different from the world and have been different, and it's been noticed and noted, and it's changed a situation somehow. This isn't always comfortable. Far from it. Salt isn't comfortable. If you've got the tiniest cuts on your hand and you put some salt near it, you'll know about it, most certainly. But the salt will also be antiseptic and doing some good in there. It won't be comfortable, but it will be good. And you are salt. You are salt, and you are light. And you are to be in the world and make a difference. Not become like the world, not to lose the saltiness. Because if you stay in the salt cellar or in the salt shaker or whatever you call it in the packet, if you stay there for long enough, you'll lose your saltiness. The point of the saltiness is to be salty, distinctive outside the packet, in the food, in the medicine, in the ointment, in the world. Get out there and be salt, be different as a Christian. Don't let the world's standards lead you and guide you. Don't let the world's ideas about what's progressive or new or good or right con you. Some things that are new are good, but many things that are new aren't good. And a Christian will discern, and we will know the difference. Some sorts of growing freedoms are much to be welcomed. Some growing freedoms aren't. And a Christian will know the difference and will graciously and politely, but clearly and sometimes bitingly stand against that. That's what salt does. And that very much in a different way is what light does. And again, as with the salt, we're not to let our light just be hidden away. To sit on your own and think pure thoughts if you can. Sit on your own and work out what's right and what's wrong in modern society or culture or directions of travel. You know, to work that out on your own is all very well if you can. But light is to shine, and we are to shine in the world as we are to be present with our saltiness in the world. Now, these are big challenges, because he's saying in both cases, if you've come to me, if you've come to Christ, if you're a disciple of mine, you are different. You are different. Now get out into the world and show that difference. Get out into the world and be different. Be salt. Make the world uncomfortable, because you won't go all the way with their nonsense and their wickedness. Make the world uncomfortable, because you will shine a light and you will be a light in darkness. Not easy, very challenging, sometimes painful, sometimes will lead to misunderstanding and persecution and mockery. And we see plenty of that when someone stands with a distinctive Christian position as a politician or as an author or an actor, and won't do or say or condone or speak for certain things. That can make them respected, but it can also make them deeply unpopular. And we're to be like that. We're to be salt and we're to be light. But then thirdly, the third difficult challenge in this passage, and great joy, but huge challenge, is in verses 17 to 20. I'm going to read that little section because it's so scary, powerful, wonderful. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. Now, we might think that because he's forgiven us. All our sins are forgiven. We are accepted. We are loved. We are welcomed. We have a place in the kingdom. It could be as if the law doesn't matter anymore, but don't think that. Don't think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoa, 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 whoa. We've heard we are forgiven, we are accepted, we are blessed, we are the light of the world, we are the salt of the world, we are God's people, we are secure. And we're now told, unless our righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, we'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. Sometimes the scribes and the Pharisees get a bad press, obviously, because they tend to be against Jesus. But who are they? What are they? Well, the scribes are the experts in the law, the professors of theology, the teachers of the law, particularly, obviously, in Jesus' day, the experts in what we call the Old Testament. And the Pharisees are, if you like, the religious exemplars, the monks, the very, very good people, the one who have stricter standards even than the Bible requires, those who don't just teach how to live, but demonstrate it. They are the ultra perfect obeyers of the law. So Jesus says those people who know the Bible best and read it and understand it and teach it, and those who live the most outwardly religious lives, your righteousness has to exceed theirs if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, more on what this means in practice in our next session as we look at the rest of this chapter, because the rest of this chapter will be opening up what it means for our righteousness to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. But for now, hear it, note it, the law is not abolished. Now, first comes grace. If you want, there are two sides of the coin. God's total love for you and acceptance of you and welcoming of you into his kingdom. That's one side of the coin. That's the first side of the coin. That's the one which we hold dear. And the second side of the coin is the demands he makes on us. He calls us to respond to his love with our whole lives, with all of we are, with our thinking, our speaking, our behaving, with our lifestyle. And this is very, very tough. And the examples he'll give later on in the chapter make it even tougher, because the law mustn't just be external obedience, it must be internal, heartfelt obedience. When we take this and take it seriously, and surely we must, this is Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, we must take it ever so seriously. When we take it really seriously, as the great preachers and teachers will tell us again and again, this is crushing. It is very, very tough. There's a bit of nonsense some people and some Bible teachers come out with, that Jesus is gentle and kind and mild, and Paul is the one who's horrible and strict and gives us rules. Here's Jesus, and he's as strict as anything in this area. Don't do away with God's law. Now, he's talking particularly about the Ten Commandments, and we'll see that in the examples he gives. He's not talking about some of the laws which particularly applied to Israel as a nation in the time of Moses. And we'll see later on, we see right through the New Testament, and go to Hebrews for this, for it in its complete form. He's not talking about the sacrificial laws, because he himself will be the sacrifice who will deal with our sin. He's talking about what we call the moral law, what is good and right before God. He's talking about what we might call ethics of money and ethics of behavior towards others, and ethics of commitment and promise and faithfulness and sexual morality and telling the truth, and all those things that are to do with how we live in society, in community, in the church, in the world, how we live with one another. All those are deep, deep matters, which we can call the moral law or ethical behavior. And he's saying in those regards, God's law is unbroken and unbreakable, and it still holds. And Christians may have been received and welcomed despite our sin, and we have been, and we are called now to spend the rest of our lives fighting and resisting that sin and turning from it and living as the salt and the light that we're called to be. One of the great preachers of the last century, and many will know this, and he was preaching largely on the Sermon on the Mount when he came up with this particular idea, preached fervently and wrote fervently against cheap grace as the enemy of the church and the enemy of the gospel. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was later martyred for his faith by the evil of the Nazi regime, he argued strongly that Christians had fallen into the trap of cheap grace. God has forgiven us, so we are forgiven, so how we live isn't crucial. Doesn't matter if we still go wrong and sin, because he will forgive us. Yes, he will forgive us, but it does matter, because grace is free. God's grace is completely freely given, utterly costly for Jesus. But once we receive the grace of being welcomed and received into the kingdom, we are then called to the utterly costly matter of discipleship, to give up our own life in following him. The utterly costly matter of living by his law, the law of love, but his law, and coming to obedience, as St. Paul calls it, the obedience of faith. Faith worked out, faith lived, is obedience. And that's what Jesus is calling us to do and to be in this astonishing, challenging Sermon on the Mount. Righteousness exceeding that of the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, as we will see next time, there's a huge internal component to this as well as the external. But the costliness is there and must be seen to be there. A French author of the last century, a committed Roman Catholic Christian, wrote a novel about the country parson and the diary of a country parson. And one of the wonderful, powerful things he said there relating to this passage was that we're called to be the salt of the earth, not the honey of the world. In other words, we're not to say to everyone, everything's all right, everything's wonderful, everything's sweet, God has forgiven us, there's nothing more we need to do, go and enjoy your life and tell everyone that God is love, that forgiveness is there, that sin doesn't matter, that judgment isn't there anymore, isn't real, because God has overcome it all, and honey, 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 everything is sweet and light. And he warned us not to talk about honey when we should be talking about salt. It's similar to the Old Testament reminder when the prophet says, don't be saying peace, peace, peace when there is no peace, because God is a judge. God is still judge. Jesus is going to be the judge of all. And God hates sin. And Jesus hates sin. Now, Jesus loves us, but the sin must be dealt with. We come to him and he accepts us. And then he wants to change us, and we must change. And sin must be dealt with and purged. We need to work out how and why, and there's more of that to come, obviously. But these are real and difficult and challenging matters. A lot of Christianity in our generation has just become honey, and we've lost the salt. A lot of Christianity in our generation, as it was in Bonhoeffer's nearly 100 years ago, is preaching cheap grace and not acknowledging the reality of sin and the need to deal with it in the believer's life and in our preaching and teaching and church living. There's some wonderful truths here. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Jesus has come to fulfill the law and the prophets. There's great stuff here. and this deep challenge to be the salt, be the light, turn from sin. Amen.